Okay, when we're talking about cryogenics, we're talking about substances at low temperatures. This can be either refrigerated gases or cold liquids. And the most commonly used cold gases and liquids range from hydrogen, helium, nitrogen, fluorine, argon, oxygen, and methane. The good news is in 99% of all cases you're going to be working with either liquid helium or liquid nitrogen, which are non-toxic and non-reactive. So they're not going to explode or they're not going to poison you. That's already good news. But of course there are some things to be kept in mind. So the properties of cryogenic fluids, we've already mentioned, these are at low temperatures. And one thing that applies to all of these liquids is that they're going to expand as they heat up. When the liquid evaporates, and they're always close to their boiling points, you will find that they expand quite dramatically in volume. And that can displace air and cause an asphyxiation hazard. Most of these liquids, they are colorless, odorless, and you don't really notice their presence except for the fact that they will displace oxygen and create an asphyxiation hazard. So here's some boiling points of these cold liquids. As the example, helium, nitrogen, and oxygen. Helium being the coldest, and they have a fairly large expansion ratio. Basically, the amount of liquids in how much amount of gas this will translate to. So all of these ratios are above 700 or 800, so they can displace quite a large volume of oxygen. You need to, when you handle cryogenic liquids, you need to store them in a proper and safe way. And cryogenic liquids are always stored in some kind of pure flask. These need to be approved for that particular cold cryogenic liquid that you're using. These tubes are supposed to be not pressurized. There are some exceptions for some nitrogen tubes that operate in that regime, but in most cases these are non-pressurized. You may have seen those. They come in different shapes and sizes. Their basic operation is always the same. They work like a thermal flask from which you drink your coffee in their basic operation. On the inside, well, they consist of an inner volume where the cold liquid is stored. Between the inner volume and the outer volume, there is some very good insulation. Here it's called super insulation layer. In most cases, it's just a vacuum layer. Then there is a tube to extract the cold liquid, or when filling, put in the cold liquid. On top, you have several things, like, for example, a liquid level gauge in some cases. There may be pressure regulators and pressure gauges. There is ports to draw the liquid, or pressure building manifolds where you can actually pressurize the insides to extract gas. So on some level, they're all going to look the same. But it's in all cases these are pure vessels. Okay, we've already mentioned the main dangers when handling cryogenic liquids is when they evaporate, they expand fairly dramatically, and they can create an oxygen deficient atmosphere and present the risk of asphyxiation, even though the gas is completely non-toxic. When it displaces oxygen, that still creates a hazard. And the second big danger is, of course, when you come in contact with a cold liquid or any cold surface, this can cause injuries due to frostburn, which is, from a medical point of view, I've been told, pretty much the same as an actual burn. So these are the main risks involved with handling cryogenics. One thing to keep in mind is that in a storage vessel there can be inadvertently or advertently the buildup of pressure, since the gas is always stored near its boiling point. And when this is not properly taken care of, this can create an actually explosion hazard. When basically there is liquid evaporating, expanding into gas, and this gas cannot escape, then at some point there is, you get into the regime where you run the risk that this vessel is actually exploding. Some of you may remember the Halloween duel we had a couple of years ago, where actually the building had to be evacuated due to a helium duel that had blocked exhaust. Some other things, well, materials alter their properties once they get cooled down. Everybody has seen the banana that gets dipped in liquid nitrogen and becomes brittle. This can happen, and once the banana shatters, you can essentially be injured by the shatters of the banana. That's what's meant with extreme temperatures alters the material properties. And another thing is you can run into the situation where actually oxygen from, when you have, for example, a pipe where cold liquid is running through, liquid helium, liquid nitrogen, for example. When this pipe gets cold, you can get actually condensation of oxygen from the air on the pipe, because actually these substances have a boiling point that's below the boiling point of oxygen. So on the outside of the cold pipe, even if your cryogen is properly enclosed, you can still get oxygen enrichment, and that could potentially create a fire hazard or explosion hazard, because oxygen is of course quite combustible. So these are the main dangers when handling cryogenics. So in terms of oxygen deficiency, well, the obvious remedy to that is to keep your working area properly ventilated. Don't close all the doors. Maybe open the windows, have some fresh air supply, some building AC vent nearby. Make sure that liquid that evaporates gets ventilated due to the building system, through the building systems in some sense. The gas, not only from the, and that applies not only from the gas that evaporates from the fuel, but also that comes out of your cryostat or from whatever form of experimental setup that you're using. So when there is a chance, when there is a place where you think there is a chance that oxygen enrichment can happen, you may want to think about installing oxygen sensors, oxygen level detectors. One thing to keep in mind, well, the most common cryogenic liquids, liquid nitrogen is heavier than air, so it will accumulate close to the floor. So you want to basically keep breathing above floor level. Liquid helium is the opposite. It will start accumulating close to the, is lighter than air, so it will start filling the room from the ceiling. So keep in mind which cryogens you're using and how they accumulate and where you want to ventilate them out of your laboratory. Well, frost burns. If you get in contact with cryogenic either liquids or also the gases, you can get burn injuries that are very similar to actual thermal burn that is caused by fire or high temperature. You can, everybody knows that when you touch a cold surface, a cold metal surface, for example, that there's a risk that you actually get stuck there. And that's basically essentially the water that's on your skin or near the surface of your skin actually freezes and fills up all the gaps, and then you stick to that surface, and then you remain in contact with a low temperature surface, and that doesn't really help. So you want to make sure that you handle cold surfaces with proper gear. As the exposure continues, you can get anything up to extreme blistering, tissue damage, and not to forget if you handle open cryogens, like pouring liquid nitrogen from one dewar to the other. If you get spills, if drops of a liquid cryogen, if you get that in your eye or even on your skin, that can also create damage. Well, in order to prevent this, definitely always wear appropriate gloves when handling cryogenics. It may be advisable to work with safety glasses or face shields, especially when you're handling open cryogens. Aprons should be worn when to protect yourself against splashing. That applies mostly if you're handling open cryogens. If you flow your cryogen through a tube from one container to the other, from transfer tubes, the risk of splashing is obviously very small. But if you pour liquid nitrogen out from one open dewar to the next, then these dangers are definitely real. And that was mentioned actually in the chemical safety presentation. If you have watches, rings, or jewelry, or anything metallic that you're wearing on your body, that's a danger. So you should definitely take those off before handling these really cold substances. They have fairly high heat conductance, so even though if you're, and they will, since they're in contact with your skin, they will keep exposing you to the cold surface. They will retain the heat for some time, get cold very quickly, and well, definitely best turn them off before, not turn them off, take them off before handling cold surfaces or touching cold liquids. If you're handling open cryogenic liquids and there is a danger that you actually be splashed from boiling liquids, you want to keep a safe distance, obviously. And the big danger, the moment when this becomes most dangerous, if you pour a cold substance like liquid nitrogen into a dewar that starts out being at room temperature, it will boil rapidly, and the rapid boiling, you can create some splashes that hit you in the face or on your clothing. So in these cases, you want to pour, when you start out with a container that's substantially warmer than the cold liquid that you're handling, you want to operate extremely slowly and cool the container down very gradually in order to minimize the danger of spills and splashes getting on you. That's basically what I just mentioned. When transferring liquefied gases from one dewar to the next, then you want to operate extremely slowly in order to prevent thermal shock or even splashes. And ideally, when you pour liquid nitrogen from one container to the next, you don't want to actually tilt it over and pour it. You want to actually use a hose to safely transfer it to the other container. Not only in terms of avoiding splash damage and other potentially dangerous situations. Also, if you handle big containers like 50 or 100 liter containers, once you have to start tilting those or pouring things in or out of them, it's much more safer if you have an actual hose pipe those through. When transporting cryogenic containers from one place to the next, make sure that some of them come on wheels, others not, but you want to make sure that you have the proper equipment to cart them around. So for different types of newer flasks, you will have different carts that are appropriate for moving those around. Yeah, when handling these transfer dewars, there are a couple of things to keep in mind. If they fall over, for example, like if you drop them or tip them on their sides, this can create breakage on the inside where the vacuum shield is located, especially when they are fixed up on their neck, and the rest of it is essentially free hanging. And if you have, if you lean them on their side, if they accidentally fall over, then you can create a fairly large torque on the neck of the dewar vessel, which it's not built to sustain. And then in some cases you can actually, that can lead to an instant loss of vacuum. When the vacuum is lost, of course, the dewar is no longer insulating, and the gas will rapidly evaporate and expand. Well, inspect your transfer dewar for frost spots where you see some condensation on the outer wall of the dewar. That's an indication that the insulation is partially or fully gone bad, and the dewar is dangerous to use and needs some repair. Either you can evacuate your dewar yourself, or in some cases it may be necessary to send it back to the manufacturer and have them fix up your dewar. But if you notice that on the outside of the dewar it starts to frost up on some spots, then the dewar is probably no longer safe to use. That's what the general knowledge is. Don't use a hollow tube or rod as a dipstick to put into the dewar to check how much cryogen is still in there. That will evaporate quite a lot of cold liquid and can create either escaping gas or an increase in dewar pressure. And that can also lead to splashing of cold liquid from the top of the dewar. So these are some situations which you're most likely not going to encounter around here. If you have to use liquid cryogens in glass vials, then be extra careful, because if you don't cool those down really slow and gradually, those will most certainly crack and can cause some extra danger due to breaking gas in the mix of splashing cryogen, and that can lead to some fairly dangerous situation. So if possible, avoid pouring or handling cryogenic liquids in uninsulated glass vials. And yeah, if you need to pick up cold objects and directly put them in or out of cryogenic liquid, then use appropriate pliers. Never put your hand into or near the surface of a cryogenic liquid. Definitely don't do that. Most cryogenic liquids don't have very high heat capacity, and if you get a little splash on your skin, it will create burns, but you're not gonna freeze from it. But when you, because it evaporates much too fast, but when you really put your hand accidentally, I hope, no, I don't hope, but I hope you're not doing it deliberately, into a cold liquids, then even if it's small heat capacity, that is something you definitely don't want to do. There is the hazard of pressure. Since these liquids are always near their boiling point, they will continuously evaporate. You want to make sure that your dewar vessel that you're using is provides a mean of the evaporated gas to escape safely. In a sense, you always have to, you cannot allow a pressure buildup either inside your dewar, either deliberately or accidentally. Most transfer dewars will come with their pressure, with their emergency pressure release that will pop automatically once the pressure exceeds a certain threshold. But there is, of course, a danger that this freezes over under certain conditions. And once your dewar has high pressure, then it will essentially turn into a bomb and present a hazard in its own right. We have had this in our department. So if you have these open dewars, you want to keep them capped off with a loose-fitting styrofoam cap that essentially will protect you from splashing cryogen, but will also not allow any pressure buildup that will essentially come off easily if the pressure inside builds up too much. You want to keep the neck of your dewars always free from ice or any other gases that can freeze and cause blockage, and the blockage could then lead to block the gas from escaping and build-up of consequential build-up of pressure. And yeah, basically only use proper containers that are actually designed for keeping cryogenic liquids. Never place cryogens in a sealed container that does not provide any means of escape. Then, yeah, well, material hazards, that's a danger that is maybe not the biggest danger, but should be kept in mind. So, ordinary materials, steel, definitely rubber and plastic, they become brittle when subjected to low temperatures. And at this point, when their material properties changes, hazards can arise, for example, from using rubber pipe that freezes and then essentially shatters from cold liquids. Essentially, just keep in mind that all materials, whether you use them inside your cryostat or for storage of cryogenic liquids, need to be able to handle cryogenic temperatures. And what the materials that are safe to use is definitely brass or copper, aluminum and bronze, but not so much plastic or rubber or even stainless steel. Oxygen enrichment, we've already mentioned that. When you transfer cryogenic fluids or gases in through uninsulated metal pipes, basically metal pipes that are on the outside in contact with air, then the surrounding air or the oxygen in the surrounding air can condense on it, and that could create an oxygen-enriched environment. And in such places, there is a danger of flammability or explosion because oxygen is, of course, highly reactive. So you don't want to store easily combustible materials near such places or keep such places clear from any spark sources or any other combustion hazard. So liquid helium is extremely cold. It's the coldest cryogenic liquid around, and air readily liquefies and solidifies when exposed to these cold liquids. And essentially anything that is in the pipes that are supposed to provide a way of your cold gas to escape, no matter whether it's water or even possibly carbon dioxide, may start to freeze and build blockages. So with such containers, be extremely careful to make sure that the pressure reliefs don't get frozen up. And the fill and vent ports of the helium dewar should be closed all the time, except when you're actually actively transferring helium. When transporting your dewar, you want to keep the escape port open. For the same reason, you always want to store and handle the helium dewars at slightly positive pressures to avoid stuff being sucked into your dewar and forming some danger due to some blockages. In the case of some spillage of large quantities of helium, where a real danger of air displacement and asphyxiation is created, then definitely evacuate your building as fast as possible. Just real briefly, a couple of specific emergency situations. Well, you have spilling of cryogens, skin exposure, and ice buildup in the dewar, and what to do in such cases. When you spill cryogens, the best thing to do would be to evacuate the area and notify PIs or lab heads, and if necessary, emergency personnel. If it's safe to do so, you may want to think about turn off ignition sources inside your lab, but don't put yourself into danger. But if a large amount of cryogen is spilled, then definitely evacuate the place. Another common emergency situation is, of course, skin exposure to cryogens or even cold surfaces. What you want to treat it basically like a thermal burn, which means run the affected area under lukewarm water, not hot water, not cold water, but lukewarm water for some substantial amount of time. Don't rub it. Maybe you may create additional tissue damage. Then what they say is not to place the affected area in your mouth to warm them up, because it could create further injury. I imagine this may be due either to damaging tissue inside your mouth or even infection or whatnot. But if necessary, seek for medical or professional attention. Ice buildup in the dewar. If the dewar port becomes frozen, then there could be an explosion hazard. Make sure that the emergency relief valves remain open. Don't try to heat it up yourself with a hot air gun. Some people want to use like metallic rods with a hot air gun to actually melt through the blockage. That is a risky business, because once the hot metallic surface touches the cold surface, then you can get a double warming by spilling cold liquids and the metallic rod coming flying at you. It's better to alert the PI and safety personnel and have some professionals take care of that. And that is all I have to say.
Any questions? One thing that I want to add is that many labs have very special kind of procedures for cryogenic equipment. That's probably the best, maybe times the best case when you need for your guy need to develop these kind of special operation procedures that takes care of all steps, so all operations are done